There we go. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Lindsay Goldstein, and I am one of the Youth Services Librarians at the Winnetka-Northfield Public Library District. I'm delighted to be joined today by our guest, John D'Amelio. A pioneer in the field of LGBTQ history and the history of sexuality, John D'Amelio is a retired professor of gender and women's studies and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the author or editor of almost a dozen books, and he recently served as the president of the Gerber Hart Library and Archives in Chicago, and his newest book, Queer Legacies, Stories from Chicago's LGBTQ Archives, was published in 2020 by the University of Chicago Press. With that being said, I'm going to pass it over to our guest of honor, John D'Amelio.
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad for this opportunity. It'll take me a minute or so to do screen sharing.
While we get the screen set up, I do want to say that we do have our question and answer box open. If you do have any questions for John as we go along, we'll be able to answer them at the end.
Okay, so I'm going to get started. Let me say that so what I'm doing tonight is providing a big picture view of the history of the LGBTQ activism from the 1950s when it got started to the early 2000s. But before I get started, I want to mention two things. This talk will discuss the oppression of LGBTQ people in the past. So some parts of it may feel upsetting or disturbing when you learn things that you didn't realize. The second thing has to do with language. Today, the term we most use is LGBTQ. But as you go back into the past, the language was often different. And so sometimes when I'm talking about the past, I may use the language of the 1960s or the 1970s rather than the language of today. So with that, let me start. And I'm starting with the background in the 1950s and 1960s, which can reasonably be called the worst time to be queer in the US. Oppression is really out there. It's undisguised, it's aggressive. It shows itself in many different ways. For instance, in 1950, the United States Senate issued a report titled "The Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government." And the most memorable line, which you can see here, was "One homosexual can pollute an entire government office." When Eisenhower became president in 1953, he almost immediately banned the employment of all LGBT people, not only from federal jobs, but also jobs with federal contractors like the entire defense industry. During these years, the military engaged in witch hunts, sometimes discharging more than a couple of thousand LGBTQ people each year with dishonorable discharges. The FBI engaged in intense surveillance of what it described as sex offenders and sex deviates, but it meant LGBTQ people. Homosexual behavior in this period of time is a crime in every single state. Sexual acts between men and between women are criminalized. Many cities and states, including Chicago, also have laws against what at that time was called cross-dressing. In other words, wearing gender non-conforming clothing. So a female-bodied individual who was wearing pants that have a zipper in the front could have been arrested for breaking the law. And you get a sense of the general public attitude about LGBTQ people by looking at some of the headlines of the Chicago Tribune during these years. Here's a set of articles from the early 1950s. In the headline, they use words like sex perverts and moral misfits. During these years, the police also have the freedom to go to gay and lesbian bars, which was the major place for people to meet, and just arrest people because maybe they were holding hands or kissing or had a hand on the shoulder of another person. And you can see, vice charges filed against 58 in bar raid, 87 in a vice net, and on and on and on. People during these years lived in the closet. Wearing a mask was the phrase that was often used. And they pretend in their lives to family, to neighbors, to friends at work, to be either heterosexual or gender conforming. Occasionally, someone becomes visible, but it's usually against their will and as an attack upon them. For instance, Bayard Rustin was a major civil rights activist who was the organizer of the famous 1963 March on Washington. A couple of weeks before the march, a senator from the South revealed in the Senate that the organizer of this event was a sex pervert. Now, Rustin survived that. The civil rights movement backed him, but it's a good example of the vulnerability that people faced. Another example is the most visible cultural representation of LGBT life in these years were so-called lesbian pulp novels. They were widely available, sold in drugstores and newsstands everywhere, and they were scandalous and negative in their portrayal of women loving women. And the covers, as you can see from this one, are offensive. The title is warped. It says on the top, Twisted Passions in the Twilight World. Now, at this point, because the oppression is so great, finally, some LGBTQ people start to be active. And in response to this oppression, a history of continuous activism finally starts around 1950. In the 50s and early 60s, the three major LGBTQ organizations were the Mattachine Society, One Incorporated, which published one magazine, and the Daughters of Bilitis. All of them were founded in California. They hold meetings, they have published lectures, they publish magazines. The Mattachine and the Daughters of Bilitis also establish a few chapters in other cities. Chicago has chapters on and off. But given the times, it was a very cautious kind of activism. I mean, look at the names of the organizations. You'd never know that these were gay or lesbian organizations. Many of the people in the organizations didn't use their real name because they didn't want to be exposed by accident. But even though they were cautious and respectable, they were life-saving organizations for the small number of people around the country who learned about them, got their magazines, and began to read about LGBTQ life. A small number of individuals in these years actually also pushed the envelope. And one of them, I'll give you some examples. One is Christine Jorgensen. She was the first American to have what then was called sex change surgery in 1952. Today we would call it, refer to it as, gender reassignment or gender affirmation surgery. That got a lot of publicity, and for the next 20 years, she remained in the public eye, trying to encourage other trans women to fight for what they really wanted. Valerie Taylor was a Chicago-based novelist in the 50s and 1960s, and she took the lesbian pulp form of fiction and wrote novels with titles like this that had positive characters of women loving women. Another person was Jose Sarria, who was a candidate for city office in San Francisco in 1961, the first LGBTQ person to ever run for public office openly. And he made his living as a bartender and as a performer in drag in San Francisco's bars. Now, by the time we get to the 1960s, with the civil rights movement making demonstrations more respectable, um, some homophile, and that was the word they used, homophile, some activists become more assertive. One in particular is Frank Kameny, who led the first gay and lesbian demonstrations in Washington, D.C. He played a key role in eventually getting the federal government to drop its ban on hiring LGBT people. He also organized the first demonstrations of LGBTQ people in Washington. I have two images here. Notice how respectable and orderly it is in terms of the way people are dressed, but still, it was a big deal to be out there with a sign that said homosexuals should be judged as individuals. By the second half of the 1950s, the upheavals of that decade of protest are reaching further into the queer community. Philadelphia, San Francisco all saw rowdy, disruptive public demonstrations in response to police harassment. Trans women were often the leaders of these demonstrations. Activists begin using the phrase gay power. And with such things starting to happen, in June of 1969, when the police in New York City raid a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, the patrons of the bar fought back and several nights of rioting ensued. And Stonewall becomes the symbolic marker of a major historical turning point, the beginnings of what was at the time called a gay liberation movement. And by 1970, the radicalism and the militancy was such that in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, the first gay pride marches are held. And I'm going to show you some images of early 70s demonstrations, and notice how different they look from those earlier images I showed you. You can see people, they're out there, they're angry, they're marching, they're like lesbian revolution, all power to the people, including gay power. And a key element of the post-Stonewall gay liberation movement was the call to come out of the closet, to reject shame, secrecy, stop pretending to be someone you're not, and declare yourself. One of the publications in New York was called Come Out. And so you would see the phrase right there on its cover. So what changes in the 1970s because of this kind of militancy after Stonewall? First, there's an explosion of organizations. There's a press and media and publishing within the community. The community wins straight allies, and there are some real victories and changes in policy and institutions. For instance, in terms of the organizations, between 1969 and 1974, the number of LGBTQ organizations grew from 50 to more than 800 in the US. That's amazing. And there were all sorts of different ones. There were local activist community organizations, there were religious-based organizations, there were cultural organizations like film festivals and singing groups and theater troupes. Organizations like the Howard Brown Medical Center and Clinic in Chicago was founded to provide health services. And the first national organizations, organizations like Lambda Legal and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force were formed. A second development was responding to how hostile the mainstream press was. Lots of LGBTQ magazines get published, and they're all the way out there. Like this is a famous one called Lesbian Tide, and they're not using names that are mysterious. They're just putting it out there. Also, there's a new kind of novel, Ruby Fruit Jungle, is probably the best-selling lesbian novel in the last 50 years that was published in the early 70s. The movement begins to win allies. The American Civil Liberties Union, the American Bar Association of Lawyers, the National Council of Churches, the American Psychological Association, all come out in the early 70s with statements opposing discrimination against based on what was then described as sexual orientation. And it's important to realize that a lot of the organizing in the 70s was about sexual orientation, not about gender identity. There were also victories. The biggest one probably was the American Psychiatric Association in 1973 removed homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. The Federal Civil Service dropped its complete ban on employment. Some states repeal sodomy laws. You have the first few laws in cities against discrimination based on sexual orientation. And a few other things are happening as well in the 1970s. Now, on the other hand, what doesn't change in the 70s? Well, although the change is significant, it's still very limited in comparison to what we have now. Most people were still living in the closet and had not come out. It was also a very internally divided population. Men and women often didn't work together because of male sexism. White people and people of color formed separate organizations because of white racism. What the transgender people, who were referred to, the word used then was transvestite, formed separate organizations because gays and lesbians weren't respectful enough of them. And there's really, for a number of years, there's a whole almost separate movement called lesbian feminism with hundreds and hundreds of organizations around the United States. So the other thing that happens, though, in the 70s is that the gains of the gay liberation movement also begin to arouse a huge amount of homophobia. And as the 60s gave birth to LGBTQ radical activism, it also spawned a counterattack and a politicized Christian evangelical movement rises up in the 1970s. The first high-profile targeting of the gay and lesbian movement came in 1977 after the Dade County in Florida, where Miami is, passed a sexual orientation non-discrimination law. And a woman named Anita Bryant, who was a former beauty pageant contestant, she was a popular singer at the time, she goes public, creates an organization called Save Our Children, and becomes a leading figure in a repeal campaign through a voter referendum. And in June 1977, voters overwhelmingly choose to repeal the non-discrimination ordinance. Bryant travels around the country promoting her Save the Children campaign. More laws are repealed in other cities. The biggest example of this occurred in California, where there was a statewide ballot initiative, Proposition 6, which would require, if it was passed, the firing of any school employees known to be gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and any school employee who spoke favorably about these issues. Now, Proposition 6, fortunately, was defeated, and it created the biggest mobilization of activists that the country had ever seen. Briggs was the name of the legislature who proposed this referendum. And also, Anita Bryant, by giving such visibility to homophobia, helps bring more people out of the closet. So pride marches in 1977 were noticeably bigger than they had been before, and they provoked the largest demonstration that Chicago had seen. So by the end of the 70s, we see the beginnings of the society we live in now, with visibility, organizations, political activism, some victories, but we're still in the early stages of change. And as the 1960s began, things weren't looking so good because of the rise of an organized opposition. And just as this wave of conservative attacks is taking off, something new enters the scene, the AIDS epidemic. And as we'll see, AIDS changes everything. AIDS was new and scary and uncontrollable. The first cases were reported in medical journals and the press in 1981. Groups of young men in LA, San Francisco, and New York were developing a rare kind of cancer and pneumonia, and their immune systems had collapsed. And the common factor in these early cases were they were all homosexuals. So the media latches on to the phrase gay cancer when it talks about it. The media, soon other groups are identified like Haitian Americans, heroin addicts. The epidemic was disproportionately affecting people of color. The media stereotypes and labels people with AIDS. And in this context, with nothing being done to educate and stop it, the number of cases and deaths explode. So by the end of 1981, 166 people in the US had died of AIDS. By 1992, the total figure was over 194,000. And most of them are dying very young, I mean, within a year of diagnosis and with very little press coverage. And then in 1985, it's revealed that on the cover of a magazine, that Rock Hudson had AIDS. And Rock Hudson was one of the great Hollywood stars of the 1950s and 60s. And once it became known that Rock Hudson had AIDS, people believed that, oh my God, anybody could now get AIDS, and it's all because of those homosexuals. And it creates panic and hysteria against the gay community, gay males, especially in the United States. There's almost no government response in the first several years. President Reagan didn't even mention AIDS for the first 5 years of his presidency. But AIDS mobilizes the gay community like never before. The first LGBTQ responses are what we might call local and self-help. The community forms local health organizations to treat people with AIDS, to take care of them and provide services. Lesbians who had been off separate from gay men get very involved with the fight against AIDS. It also leads to a lot of political organizing in cities and counties as activists, AIDS activists, push for funding from the city government to deliver services and help people who are sick. HIV is finally identified in 1984. And at that point, local education efforts begin about risk reduction, like no sharing of needles for those who are using drugs or condom use if you're having sex. Anyway, just as all of this horrible stuff is happening, the Supreme Court in 1986, 5 years into the epidemic, issues a decision in a case called Bowers versus Hardwick that declares that state laws criminalizing homosexual sex are constitutional. The language the justices use is offensive. They say there's no such thing as a fundamental right to commit homosexual sodomy. This would go against millennia of moral teaching. Well, as you can imagine, the decision is enraging. And if you combine Hardwick with the AIDS epidemic, the impact on activism was dramatic. And one good example of this to measure change. In 1979, on the 10th anniversary of Stonewall, 10 years after Stonewall, there was a march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, and about 100,000 people came, which was respectable. In 1987, there's a second march for lesbian and gay rights and against AIDS, and over 500,000 people come. It was like the largest demonstration in history that anybody knew about. So by the end of the 80s, AIDS is going way beyond generating local responses. It's mobilizing the population as never before. And a key moment comes in 1987, when there are the beginnings of direct action groups, protest groups in a number of cities. And lots of activists deserve credit for this, but I want to mention one in particular named Larry Kramer, because of his high media profile. He was a Hollywood screenwriter, a high-profile novelist. He writes an essay early on called 1112 and Counting, meaning that's how many people had died at that point, and says, we're all going to die unless we get angry and do something. He writes a play about AIDS called The Normal Heart, which gets produced all over the United States. And in a speech that he gives in New York in 1987, it leads to the formation of a direct action group called AIDS, ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And over the next 6 years, ACT UP does amazing things. They disrupt the New York Stock Exchange. They conduct a die-in in Daley Plaza that completely stops pedestrian movement. They block traffic on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. They invade the offices of the Food and Drug Administration in Maryland. And they disrupt a mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City because the Catholic cardinal in New York had been so anti-gay and anti-AIDS. And it gets lots of media coverage. And I'm just going to run you through a few images of these demonstrations and the posters they use that will give you a sense of the feelings and the anger that is associated. Silence equals death was a major slogan of ACT UP. You can see it there again. These folks are angry. Stop the church. Here's a Chicago demonstration. Cardinal Bernardin was the Chicago Catholic cardinal. Here's one of the most famous poster. Reagan, he kills me. For many Blacks and Latinos unable to afford AIDS care, the cost of living is too high. The government has blood on its hands. This is a picture of a Chicago activist named Danny Sotomayor, who was also a cartoonist and went way out there. And he produced a lot of cartoons that really attacked the political system for their lack of concern. So what else changes? I also, besides ACT UP, I want to talk about the Names Project quilt, which also began in 1987. It was an effort to make quilt panels to honor the memory of those who have died. It was displayed on the mall at the 1987 March on Washington. There was a big exhibition of it at Navy Pier in Chicago on 1988. And it has the effect of making the price of AIDS in lives lost very, very real. I'll give you just a few images of quilt panels. And you'll notice that they reveal something about the person. So here, Gregorio Ramirez, the Mexican flag, David Thompson, the universities that he went to, Neil Lamonaco, who was a cellist, a man who died of AIDS, who was a father. And this is a panel in honor of one of the earliest AIDS activists who died, Roger Gale Lyon. So by the early 90s, all of this activism is really making a difference. The LGBT community BT community is working as part of a national coalition of nurses, doctors, social workers to fight AIDS, and they begin to have, for the first time, some national victories. So in 1990, Congress passes the Ryan White Care Act, which provides federal funding for AIDS prevention programs throughout the United States. Congress also passes the Americans with Disabilities Act, which makes discrimination of disabled people, against the law, and being HIV positive is considered a disability. And in 1992, as a major marker of change, in Bill Clinton's campaign for the presidency, it's the first time a presidential candidate actively seeks out the support of the gay community and speaks to the community on the issues that matter to it. Now, I said before that AIDS changes everything. Well, let me give some more examples of what I mean. Lots of people come out, far more than in the 1970s, because now it's not just a question of sexual freedom, it's a matter of life and death. And this coming out spreads from big cities and university towns to smaller communities, suburbs all around the United States. AIDS, because it's a matter of life and death, AIDS motivates people to reveal themselves. The 1987 March on Washington is also a key catalyst because 500,000 people go to it and their lives are changed forever by an experience like that. Another change is that LGBT organizations, both AIDS organizations and other community organizations, grow so fast that they're able to raise enough money to hire paid staff instead of being completely volunteer organizations. And that's a big deal because now you have people being paid to be activists. The mainstream alliances form between AIDS organizations and other policy-oriented organizations. And all of this grows significantly in the late 80s and into the 1990s. And it has an effect. For instance, finally, it's no accident that in 1986 and New York and in 1988, Chicago finally passed non-discrimination laws based on sexual orientation. And some states are starting to pass these laws as well. And finally, another major change is, well, it's not finally, but another major change is greater involvement in electoral politics and learning how to lobby legislators to get what you need. Now, the change doesn't stop with all this. Another form of change that occurs is that there's a much heightened visibility and organizing among people of color. The activism is not new, but AIDS leads to a new threshold of organizing because Black and Latinx communities were disproportionately affected by AIDS and HIV. So by the late 1980s, you have many new organizations like YEGO, Latino, Latina, Lesbian, and Gay Organization, a national group, the National Black, Lesbian, and Gay Leadership Forum, the Minority AIDS Project in Los Angeles, which was a model for many other cities, and a National Minority AIDS Coalition as well. Two local examples, in 1993, for the first time, there's an LGBTQ contingent in the Bud Billiken Parade on the South Side. And in 1995, a group of women-loving women Latinas form Amigas Latinas, which becomes a major activist organization in the Chicago area. Another really important change that AIDS provokes is increased visibility and organizing among bisexuals and transgender folk. AIDS really led to the targeting of bisexuals. the mainstream media presents them as responsible for spreading this gay disease into what was called the general population because their gay relationships are hidden and then they have sex, men have sex with women. Bisexual organizing really takes off in the 80s, locally and nationally. The first national organization is formed in 1990 at a conference named BiNet. Bisexuals are a big contingent in a 1993 March on Washington. They also publish lots of newsletters and have local organizations. AIDS also helped to expose the marginalization of the trans population, especially trans women. Different factors put them at risk. There's a different kind of community education is necessary. And so gay and lesbian groups weren't doing this, and so it leads to independent organizing. And by the mid-1990s, the phrase LGBT starts getting used widely in many activist and community settings. Another really significant change that happens in the 1990s is a more visible representation in popular culture. The film Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, for which he wins an Academy Award for playing a gay man with AIDS. A play about AIDS named Angels in America by Tony Kushner, which wins all sorts of awards. MTV, one of the first reality stations, and it had a show called The Real World, and Pedro Zamora was a Cuban American who comes out on it. And then in 1996 and 1997, Ellen DeGeneres in her series Ellen, over a period of several episodes, slowly starts to come out, both as a character in the series and coming out as Ellen DeGeneres. And there's an episode in which Oprah Winfrey plays her therapist and urges her to come out. I want to reference the Zamora person again, because as I say, he's the first out gay man on MTV's Real World, which really broke TV barriers in 1994. Now, the last sort of area I want to just mention is that all of this change also leads to a greater visibility in national politics. In 1993, for 6 months, when Clinton is president, there's a gays in the military debate. And it doesn't lead to the end of the ban, but it shifts it to a don't ask, don't tell policy, which is a little bit better. On the other hand, the marriage issue is arising in 1990s. And in 1996, Congress passes the Defense of Marriage Act, which prevents the federal government from recognizing state-supported same-gender, same-sex marriages. There are also many ballot measures in the states in 1996 and 2004, which prevent marriage equality. But then, what you can notice is that somehow entering national politics at this period, while it's a good thing, it could also lead to real defeats. But the thing that I want to mention is that national debate can also lead to a historic victory. And in 2003, the Supreme Court in the Lawrence versus Texas case decriminalizes same-sex love and relationships. And it's a significant marker of change. Criminality is no longer the starting point. At least lesbian, gay, and bi people are no longer considered criminal. It didn't extend to trans. So this in 2003, the new century, is a major thing. There's so much more that could be said about the last 2 decades, and I won't say it because it will go on forever. The key issues have been the way the marriage campaign played out in so many states, and eventually the legalization of marriage equality, an explosion of organizing among youth and in schools at the end of this last century and in the 2000s. thousands and thousands of gay straight alliances or queer straight alliances formed in high schools and middle schools. And then finally, in the last handful of years, the issue of gender identity and trans visibility has become increasingly central and very, very visible. So the very last two things I want to mention briefly. If you're interested in learning more about LGBTQ history, in Chicago, in Rogers Park, we have an organization called the Gerberhardt Library and Archives. Gerberhardt.org is their website. It has a huge amount of Chicago area queer history on it. And I'll also mention that my newest book, which Lindsay referred to in her introduction, Queer Legacies, Stories from Chicago's LGBTQ Archives, consists of about 35 or 40 really short stories, 5 or 6 pages about a person or an episode or an event. So it's a very, very easy read. So I think at that point I will end and be open to any questions or comments. And I will also stop the share, I think.
Thank you so
Yes.
much for all of your wonderful insight. This is so informative. We learned a lot tonight. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box or just in the regular chat, and we can absolutely answer those. Give just a minute or so in case anybody has anything.
And one of the things I'll say is that this talk that I gave, for years, I taught a course at UIC that was a semester-long course in which all of the material that you just heard was developed so that it took up the whole semester. So there's so much that can be learned about LGBTQ oppression, but also activism and successful social change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time tonight. And with no questions, we will go ahead and end the broadcast. We will be emailing out a recording of this session. It will be live on our YouTube channel for the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much, John. It was a pleasure hearing from you.
And it was a wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Okay. Bye.